Okay, in the last segment we saw that friction had sort of a smart aspect to it, that if you pushed a little bit, friction would put back, and you push a little more, and friction would push back harder. But once the object started to slide, then friction would push back only with the same amount of force, and that would allow the book to accelerate from rest. What I want to do now is take a look at why that might be, and also give you a sense of how the direction of friction can act. And to do that, I want to introduce a model called the friction bump model of friction. Here's the idea. We have a book, and the surface of the book might seem very smooth to you, and so might the tabletop that we're pushing it across. But in fact, if you drill down to the microscopic level, then in fact you'll see that the book is fairly rough, and so is the tabletop. In other words, there are bumps. Let's imagine that this is the tabletop, and these I'll call the friction bumps. This just represents the roughness on the surfaces. And here's the book. And so I want to give you a sense of how to see how the friction force might act. All right, so if we set the book on the table, then we're liable to set these bumps down in this sort of way. And you'll notice that those friction bumps aren't interacting. If we just set the book down, then the free body diagram on the book looks like this. Of course, we've got the weight vector and the normal force there, but no side-to-side forces. Now, if instead we take this book and we start to push, then what happens is as we move this, the book moves a very slight microscopic distance, not anything that you would notice, but very slight distance such that the friction bumps start to interact. You'll see it there, you'll see it there. And what happens is, in that interaction, that's what happens with friction. Let's try to blow that up just a little bit in size. Bring that back there where they're interacting. Those guys out of there. All right, so let's look at that where the interaction is happening. So at that point, that's friction acting, and at that point, the friction force is acting this way on the book, and in fact this way on the tabletop. You can see this block pushing up against that block like that, and this block pushing that way against that block, or that bump. So what we've done is, by applying a force this way to the book, person on book, we've caused there to be an interaction between the friction bumps on the book and the tabletop, and caused there to be a friction force table on book backwards. Now, as long as those bumps don't slide against each other, why, we can push harder and harder, and friction will push back harder and harder. And we saw that in the last part of the video, where the greater this got, the greater this got, but only up to a point. Now, what happens at that point? All right, well, at that point, what happens is that the book starts to actually ride up against, and you still get these interactions every time the bumps hit. But the book starts to ride up and over those bumps, and so it starts to slide. And because the interaction is not so great then, because they're just kind of skipping across the surface like that, then the friction force actually drops a little bit. And so during motion, the friction force drops off compared to not. And that's actually called the region of kinetic friction versus static friction. Let me go back to my chart here and label those. So this region in here, we say the friction is static. The objects aren't sliding relative to one another. And this is the kinetic region, because the objects are sliding. Kinetic means motion. All right, so in this video, we've tried to create we've created a model for friction. In the next video, we'll take a look at how to use that model to predict the direction of the friction force.